Hello and welcome to Policy Watch, the show that brings you in-depth analysis of the week's top economic stories. We try and go beyond the headlines and get you up to date with major policy developments during the week. This is our 13th episode, and this week we'll talk about the new poverty estimates that the Planning Commission came out with on Monday and the subsequent government volte-face on the same. We'll also discuss the rollback of the railway fares hike barely a day after Mukul Roy replaced Dinesh Trivedi as the Railways Minister. We'll top it off with the Supreme Court quashing the government's review petition in the Vodafone tax case. And to discuss all this, Shubhamoy Bhattacharjee joins us again, returns to Policy Watch this week. Welcome to the show, Shubho, for one more time. It's great to have you on the show again. Now, let's talk about these poverty estimates for a bit. Before we go into the story, what does this reduction, 7.3 reduction in poverty, this drop in poverty really mean? What is this a reduction of?
It's essentially a fact that India is growing, and as it is growing, it's pushing the people out of the poverty vicious circle. That's what a vicious circle of poverty, which is what we had all grown up reading with. So essentially what we are saying is that the number of people, the people below the poverty line, the percentage of people, that has come down. It's not come down in absolute terms. The number of people below poverty line is still higher year on year, but the rate of growth has come down.
Right.
That's what 7% is. That's
on the face of it, when the government came out with these numbers, the Planning Commission did, Montek Singh Ahluwalia and his team, and we talked to Dr. Chaudhary at the Planning Commission as well. He was on the show that day, and I asked him the same question. Simplify this for us, Dr. Chaudhary. I had asked him, on the face of it, Shubhamoy, it would look like that things are getting better for the country. Is it that simple?
Yes, it is. Essentially, economy is a response to very few stimuli. I mean, and the job of getting an economy working is where the most of the action should be concentrated on. Once that's done, the rest of the economy falls in line. It's essentially we are saying that if you get your growth story together, the poverty will come down. Right. Why has it happened? Because the last 5 years has been one of the fastest pace of GDP growth. So it's not surprising that in the last 60 years, if that has been the fastest pace, in the last 60 years, this is the fastest pace of poverty reduction. And that's how it follows.
We'll talk about the subsequent volte-face also, but we'll have a look at what we filed. Now, the past week saw India's top policymakers arrive at new estimates of poverty in the country. But by the end of the week, the government, in a volte-face, rejected the formula used by the Planning Commission to arrive at those figures. Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, while scrapping the Planning Commission's definition of poverty, also said that there was a need to devise a new formula to calculate poverty estimates. The Planning Commission had released the latest poverty estimates on Monday, showing a decline in the incidence of poverty by 7.3% over the past 5 years. By doing so, the plan panel had effectively stated that anyone with a daily consumption expenditure of 28 rupees 35 paisa in urban areas and 22 rupees 42 paisa in rural areas was above the poverty line. The new poverty estimates for 2011-2012 have only added to the furor triggered by the Commission's affidavit in the Supreme Court in October, in which the BPL cap was pegged at rupees 32 and 26 for urban and rural areas respectively. Rahul Kapoor filed this report. Take a look.
The Prime Minister on Friday rejected the methodology used by the Planning Commission to arrive at the 2011-12 poverty estimates, stressing the need to devise a new formula to define poverty. This comes as a major embarrassment for the Prime Minister's close aide and Deputy Chairman of the Commission, Montek Singh Ahluwalia, especially after he chose to defend the methodology post the fervour it created. The Planning Commission estimates had pegged the total number of people below the poverty line at 35.46 crore as against the 40.72 crore in 2004-05. In rural areas, the Commission put the number at 27.82 crore and the urban BPL number at 7.64 crore. According to the Planning Commission estimates, poverty declined by 8% in rural areas, down from 41.8% to 33.8%, 4.8% in urban areas, down from 25.7% to 20.9%. The new estimates came under heavy fire from civil societies as well as food activists, even as the Planning Commission held a hastily arranged press conference to defend the revision in the poverty numbers.
The basic poverty line is the same. When we were asked to update by the court what is the most recent, that was June 2011, Here, we are using the poverty line for the consumer survey of 2009-2010, and therefore this is a little lower than what was reported last year.
As per the Household Consumer Expenditure Survey for 2009-10, 29.9% of the total population came under the below poverty line category. This was an improvement from the 2004-2005 numbers, when 37.2% of the population were classified as BPL.
Critics of the new estimates, however, point out that in 2009-2010, NREGA provided 52.5 million households with work. And in a happy coincidence for the government, 52.5 million people were pulled out of poverty during the 5-year period in which NREGA was implemented.
That the entitlement of food subsidy benefits are not being restricted to those below the official poverty line. That entitlement is separately going to be handled in the food security bill, which is not yet, which is with the standing committee.
The junking of the poverty estimates is sure to be exploited by the opposition as a classic case of government flip-flop on major policy initiatives. And with the Suresh Tendulkar report being dubbed non-satisfactory by the PM, this man will have a tough task ahead of him to redeem the plan panel's reputation.
Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
Obviously, Prime Minister has come out with a statement saying the Suresh Tendulkar committee that is not really satisfactory, and we have to arrive at a new formula, devise a new formula. First of all, is the Prime Minister right?
The Prime Minister is right that you've got to keep on defining poverty every time after a certain number of years. So there's nothing surprising if you look at it at face value. What I'm surprised is that this government is repeatedly losing face on something on which they should have been able to explain clearly. See, what the problem is not about the fact that poverty is declining, or rather, in fact, the problem is that it is such an interesting thing for a government. When growth rises, poverty will come down. The problem is an opposition group would not like the government to say that poverty is coming down. It happened during the BJP years. The government of that time came out with the estimate that the poverty had declined. The Congress was furious. Now the scales are reversed. This has got nothing to do with how the statistical methodology works. None of those guys have looked at it and have even less understanding of how this thing is done.
Right.
And that is why the problem is a good story of poverty reduction is plainly difficult for an opposition group which is gunning for a government's removal. And so if this is going to be played out repeatedly, every time any government comes out and says poverty has gone down, they'll say, hello, you haven't done it.
But are you surprised by the sudden volte-face by the government? Montek Singh Ahluwalia, obviously very close aide of the Prime Minister. Source of embarrassment for him also. Monday they come up with estimates. He holds a hastily held press conference, defends it rigorously, but then 2 days later the Prime Minister comes and junks it. Could be a source of embarrassment.
Not really. I mean, Athar, if you look at it, what's happening here is that first of all, the government's entitlement program has gone way beyond poverty line indexes. That will be based on the socio-economic census, results of which should be out by July. Now, if that is the case, what the government is saying that anybody, for instance, malnutrition isn't one-to-one correlation with poverty, or say housing problem. It's not exactly that only the people below the poverty line are entitled to housing support. So those would in any case be worked out differently by the organizations.
Something Montek Singh Ahluwalia made very clear.
Absolutely. Now, if that is the case, first of all, one, as an outside observer, we can ask that whether there was a need to come out with the fresh numbers. And having done so, as you're saying, the issue is that they should stick to it. The point is that this technical revision is, in any case, was due. And it was supposed to be going along regularly. The problem comes along because the debate gets badly captured in a stupid number.
Right.
And that number is the 28 rupee.
Right.
You know, poverty is not defined on a daily basis. Poverty is defined on a monthly expenditure. It might seem that, okay, fine, you've got monthly expenditure, so you divide it. But you and I know, every day we don't spend the same amount of money every day. So poverty calculation is a monthly figure. You look at the monthly entitlement, and the critical thing is no one is saying that if a person goes above 3,300 rupees a month, he or that family has got it made. They're still very, very poor.
Right.
It is simply a question of saying that below this amount of money, the person doesn't even have a chance of surviving.
Surviving, right.
That is exactly what it is saying. It's not saying anything more.
I think you're right. This whole debate of who can live on 28 rupees or 22 rupees,
They
I
can't.
think it's looking at it and hammering on the wrong point. That is not the point to be understood.
Absolutely.
There's far deeper methodology inside it. Obviously, let's also talk about Narega now. Before we talk about Narega, do you think the government had any need, the plan panel had any need to push these revised numbers through in the budget session? There's so many other things on the government's platter right now. Do you think it was the right move doing that in the middle of the budget session?
Well, Athar, that's a very good point. But after all, if a government, when it is discussing the budget of a country, cannot or does not come out with relevant figures and data, then there's a problem that we have. This is the time to discuss these issues. Rest of the year, I mean, there might be other time you might be discussing Lokpal, at other time you might be discussing something else. But budget session is therefore a very good time to focus attention on numbers which make the policy making clear.
Right.
So to that extent, I think it's a good idea. The fact that whether they're able to defend it or not is the government's
And
problem.
they haven't been, because obviously the Prime Minister has taken a different view than the plan panel. Now, Narega, obviously in a happy coincidence, like our report said, the number of people that were pulled out of poverty between 2000, in the year 2009-10, Narega provided 52.53 million households with employment. Now, in a happy coincidence for the government, 52.5 million were pulled out of poverty. Do you think that has something to do with it? Does it mean that Narega is working and working extremely well, if those figures are correct?
You know, the problem here is, this is where entitlement program or that idea of inclusive growth runs into trouble. This government has committed itself that growth isn't enough, or rather growth doesn't matter. So we will go in for what is called programs of entitlement, food for work, basically, which is Narega. As we've been pointing out, that those don't work, and those don't actually pull people out of poverty. But at one stage, you have got these numbers coming out. Now you either accept, which is that it is the GDP growth which is basically pulling people out of poverty, or else you say, again, the GDP growth doesn't matter. It is simply Narega, and so therefore I have to keep on putting money into that. So, you know, it's a bind which this government has created for itself.
Right.
You accept the basic principles that it's essentially working for methods and means to ensure that your growth happens well. Then you can ensure that the poverty also
It'll be
comes
interesting
down.
to see. The Prime Minister has having a new methodology. It'll be interesting to see how the Planning Commission arrives at that
I mean, the new
methodology.
methodology is already there. There's going to be the socio-economic census. So that's, in the case, going to give a much more granular picture of people in their different stages of the income stream.
Absolutely. We'll talk about this and a lot more other stories that we have for you today. We'll take a short breather. We'll come back and continue our conversation with Shubhamoy Bhattacharjee. Don't go anywhere. Stay tuned. Welcome back. You're still watching Policy Watch, and we're still in conversation with Shubhamoy Bhattacharjee. Now, before we go back to Shubhamoy and a chat with him again, let's just give you an idea of what happened in the railway rollback, the hike rollback. Now, a struggling UPA government caved in to pressure over the first increase in rail fares for 8 years, announcing a sweeping rollback just days after the Trinamool Congress forced the resignation of then Railways Minister Dinesh Trivedi. The first order of business for the new Railway Minister Mukul Roy was pretty clear after he replaced Trivedi. And along expected lines, the fare hike was rolled back, with the new rail minister dubbing the hike a huge drain on the pockets of the Aam Aadmi. The fares for second-class suburban and non-suburban sleeper, AC chair car and AC 3-tier have been rolled back. The fare in AC 1 and AC 2 classes were, however, kept untouched. Last week, Mukul Roy's predecessor had raised it to 15 paisa per kilometre for AC 2-tier and 30 paisa per kilometre for AC 1. More importantly, the rail minister has kept on hold the decision to set up a committee to explore the possibility of an independent tariff regulatory authority. The proposal to expand the railway board has also been scrapped. This is a setback to the already cash-strapped railways, as it is expected to lose over 7,000 crore worth in revenue that could have come its way as a result of the proposed hikes. Now, the whole drama that unfolded, Dinesh Trivedi having to resign, pressure from Kolkata, then Mukul Roy replacing and sweeping rollback immediately after he took over. Now, is this a huge setback for the railways because they have no money?
Yeah, in fact, interesting, Athar used a very interesting phrase, the first order of business. I thought that was the first and the last order of business for Mukul Roy this year. Essentially, because he'll take 1 year, it takes about a year for you to get an idea of how the railways is operating. After all, it's not something that you can just come in and assume that you have God-given knowledge. So it'll be 1 year. By the end of that year, if he's lucky, he might have the job with him,
Right.
or else if it's time for election or whatever, and that's the end of it.
But
So
so isn't
it's
this a
finished.
classic case of the government capitulating again in front of allies that are playing truant? Mamta Di has heard them before, had burned them before. Can't they learn the lesson? Why is this happening? Isn't the government just giving in too much to its allies?
I know. I fully agree with that idea. It is giving too much, and frankly speaking, at a time when opinion is actually for the changes that Dinesh Trivedi brought in.
Absolutely.
Without going into the details of what is it, at the first stage we can say that if it's a crazy state of affairs, when the railway workers union say that we want a hike in fares, and the railway minister, the current railway minister says we don't want a hike. So the railway workers, the railway passengers haven't particularly complained. We'll have, if they had been, there have been massive demonstrations, we would have known. No one is going to go in for that. So essentially, it is a dysfunctional system where a political structure says, no, we will not give what the people want.
Right. So, digressing from the economic part of it and going to the political side of it, the government has had problems with all its allies, be it the DMK, be it Mamata Banerjee now. Now, can't the government do something? They have some sort of clandestine support with Mulayam, in Mulayam Singh Yadav in the parliament. I think he has 22 MPs, Mamata has only 19 or 20. Can't they just give an ultimatum to whoever's playing truant, whoever's playing the bad cop in the relationship and say, look, enough is enough, and if you don't support us on key economic reforms, we'll get our support somewhere else. Doesn't that option lie in front of the government now?
It should lie, but what will happen is when I play footsie with one guy, then obviously the other guy also takes lessons from there. So what determines that when this group comes into as a support group, and assuming one of them becomes a minister, say the Minister for Defense, and then in that case, that person says, no, we don't like the Rafale deal. We'll reopen the file and go back for right from the beginning.
Right. So it's a double-edged sword.
Yes, it is.
Right. Now, this episode, the whole episode, if I could call it that, doesn't it prove that even if the government wants to initiate economic reforms, anything that is perceived to be anti-common man or anti-Aam Aadmi, or like Mamta Di would say, Mamati Manush, is anything that goes against the perceived interest of the common man will be resisted. Isn't that very dangerous for the country?
Yeah, what is essentially happening is that the political class has not realized what is necessary for the country. And that is the problem, that while India has actually moved on, the population and in every strata has moved on, the political class is still hijacked to ideas which they were espousing 15, 20, 30 years ago. And that is where the problem lies. And I think the problem lies more not with the allies, but with the ruling majority party. Because they also, right from the beginning, have not really been saying that we want these changes to happen. They have not been able to articulate clearly that what the economy needs, what are the steps to be needed. They sort of keep on pushing it on those steps of the allies. There are so many policy decisions which, for instance, the allies have got nothing to do with it. Issues like I remember discussing last time, the issues about telecom auction was something that the allies did, but it was something which wasn't a policy issue. None of the allies sort of stood up to say, no, we want allocation, we didn't want auction. It wasn't. It was the government it was a majority party which couldn't get its act together on it and created such a furor. So to blame the allies for the problems that's happening on very, very key issues is actually quite unfair.
Right. So let's talk about railways for a bit again. 65% of the revenue comes from freight. It used to be 35 per passenger, it has come down to 27% now. Isn't that, I'm asking you this, isn't it bad economics, extremely bad, flawed sense of economics to roll back this fare hike? That could have got them at least 7,000 crore and more maybe. Isn't that just skewed economics?
Absolutely. And what it does is the railways, more than anyone, is in much worse shape than its budget shows. Its operating ratio, if all the factors are taken in, is actually more than 100. That means every time a railway train moves, it actually creates more expenditure for the railways than revenue. Now, if that is the situation, there is a need for very drastic surgery, and that surgery cannot be put off.
Right.
The fact that we are having so many accidents, not just in the trains which carry passengers, but even of railway freight go-downs. Railways, Indian railways have the worst accident safety record in the world. There are 40 people who die on an average on the railways every day. It's probably one of the world's worst railway networks.
Shoma, what do you see for the future of Indian Railways? Is it going to become another Air India? Is it going to become another Kingfisher? If they have no revenues, they have no source of money, what does the future hold for the railways?
Yeah, in fact, frankly, it is trouble. And it's much more trouble because they've got a very efficient financing arm called the Indian Railway Finance Corporation, which actually raises money from the market. Now, the problem is it's a very efficient arm raising money for the railways, so and at a clip which the railways aren't able to handle. So we are not only doing trouble for the railways, we are also creating a major disaster for the capital markets.
Right. Absolutely. We'll continue our discussion after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We have one more story to discuss with Shubhamoy Bhattacharjee. We'll be back in just a while. Welcome back. You're still watching Policy Watch. Now, in yet another setback for the government in the Vodafone tax case, the Supreme Court has dismissed the review petition filed by the central government. With the quashing of the petition, the Apex Court has upheld its earlier ruling of no tax liability in the Hutch Vodafone transaction. Vodafone had won a 5-year-long legal battle against Indian tax authorities in January as the Supreme Court dismissed a $2.2 billion tax demand against the British giant's acquisition of Indian mobile assets in 2007. The taxman, however, interestingly, is not ready to give up just yet. Media reports have suggested the tax authorities are getting ready for round 2 of the tax battle and are likely to issue a fresh demand notice in June this year. Shoma, were you surprised when the government review petition was quashed by the Supreme Court?
No, not really. Because if it's the same bench, and essentially they were reiterating their own judgment, and that judgment had laid down very clear principles on why this particular case had been rejected.
Right.
So.
But media reports have suggested that the taxman is going to issue a fresh demand notice. If they've already lost the case in the Supreme Court, twice if I could call it that, what is the point of filing another review petition, a fresh demand?
Yeah, and also the problem is that if you do it, then what you do essentially are telling the company is, and any other company, is that no matter what happens in the court, I'm going to get back and I'm going to go on hammering at this thing repeatedly till I get the money out.
Right.
And in the process, what the finance ministry has also done is they've introduced this validation clause, which essentially says that no matter, irrespective of whatever the court judgment, a tax notice raised by the income tax department continues to remain valid, and which no court or tribunal can strike down.
Right. So isn't that like a point of contention now between the judiciary and the government? There could be a potential flashpoint in the future?
Absolutely. I mean, once the substantial issue comes up in the Supreme Court. See, this review was a very minor point of law issue. But do you go back on your judgment to have a quick look at it? So that is out of the question. Now, since the law itself has been changed and substantive changes retrospectively have been incorporated in the Income Tax Act 1962, the problem now is that going forward, does the Supreme Court say that since the validation of the law itself is different now, the case ab initio needs to be opened up.
Right. But won't this give the wrong kind of signal to other investors who want to invest their money in the country? If Vodafone is being, I don't want to use the word harassed because obviously not, they have a point as well, the taxman has a point as well, and they're just doing their duty. Don't you think investor confidence will be shaken by this case?
Yeah, Athar, you're right. And what happens is, you know what, there's a difference here that India still remains a very attractive investment destination. So no one is packing his bag and running away. No one is going to say that I am not going to do business in India. The investors will come. What it does is it raises the risk percentage for the investors. So in that case, what happens is the amount protection that they take, the architecture that they build up is more costly for the economy.
Right, right.
They'll be taking on more adequate precautions. They'll be there'll be lots of things that they will be building in, which actually is not good for the economy.
Right, right.
To protect their investment.
Right.
That is where the danger lies.
Right.
That we have given out the wrong signal. It's not right for the government to say, no, hang on, I mean, investment is coming. Sure, investment will come. It might not change at all with this judgment, whatever way. But what it'll do is it'll tell the investors that when you deal with India, deal with it slightly differently. It's a risky market.
Right, right.
And that profile, therefore, gets factored into their calculation.
Last question on Vodafone, Shubhamoy. Even if the government, the tax department does raise this fresh tax demand in June like they promised, do you think that Vodafone has slight edge over it since two judgments have already gone in their favor?
Yeah, I
They
would
have a
think
slight
so.
edge.
They have.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll try something new on the show today. We discussed 3 stories today, Shubhamoy. Your key take on each of the stories, starting with the poverty estimates, what came out of it?
Yeah, and Athar, you started off by saying this is the 13th edition. It's turned out to be quite it's 13th the bad day for the government. I mean, all the ways they've actually done a bad way. So I suppose that is the overarching thing.
Right. So lucky number 13 for us, but unlucky number 13 for the government. All right, that was Shubhamoy Bhattacharjee. Thank you so much for joining us, Shubhamoy. It was a pleasure talking to you like always. The poverty estimates, of course, something the government could have avoided. The volte-face was something they could have avoided. The railway hike rollback also, like we discussed, not very good for the railways. They need cash desperately. They are cash strapped and some revenue needs to come in. Vodafone, of course, has a slight edge because they've already had 2 rulings go in their favor. Thank you so much for watching Policy Watch. This was our 13th edition. Till next time, thank you and goodbye.